Roselyn had always believed that at 72 years old, the greatest gift life still owed her was a quiet evening on the porch and the gentle company of children who remembered who'd raised them. Instead, she received a folded eviction notice slid under her door and the unbearable silence of 3 grown adults who'd forgotten every sleepless night she'd ever given them. Evicted from the small rental she'd kept clean and tidy for 19 years, with nothing but a cracked leather suitcase and a promise her late father Augustus had whispered to her 40 years ago when his hands were still strong enough to carve a man's name into oak, she walked alone down the cracked shoulder of Old Mill Road toward an abandoned workshop her family had always sneered at as a pile of rotting wood and rusted regret, but that Roselyn had always called the only place on earth where she'd ever truly belonged. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever been judged by people who never bother to ask for your side of the story, if you've ever carried the weight of a lie so heavy it bent your back for decades, if you've ever stood in front of your own children and felt invisible to the very people you bled and starved and prayed for, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because what Roselyn Tatum is about to discover behind that locked workshop door doesn't just rewrite her own life. It brings a powerful man, a man who wore a badge and used it like a weapon, to his knees in front of a town that worshipped him for 40 years. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Roselyn Marie Tatum stood on the buckled sidewalk outside the small clapboard rental on Sycamore Street and watched 2 men she'd never met carry her cedar wardrobe down the front steps and slide it into the back of a battered donation truck. Not a moving truck, not a storage truck, a donation truck, painted with the cheerful logo of a charity she'd never even heard of, driven by strangers who would pick through 40 years of her life inside some warehouse on the edge of Mosswood Hollow and decide, piece by piece, what was worth keeping and what would be tossed onto a pile to be sold for 50 cents. Her 3 grown children stood in a tight little group on the cracked walkway, sipping coffee from the diner down the street, watching the men work. Watching their 72-year-old mother be dismantled like a piece of furniture nobody wanted anymore. "Mama, you have to step back from the door," Clayton said without looking at her, his voice carrying that flat, businesslike tone he used at the real estate office when he was trying to push a hesitant buyer into closing. He was 48 years old, her oldest, the boy she'd carried on her hip through 3 flu seasons and 2 miscarried jobs. He couldn't even turn his head to look at her. "The new tenants are coming through tomorrow at 9. Mr. Pruitt wants the place broom cleaned by tonight. You're slowing the men down. Slowing them down. Not breaking apart in front of them. Not losing the only home she'd known since Walter died. Just slowing the men down." Roselyn looked at the little house, with its peeling slate blue paint and the mismatched window boxes she'd repaired herself with finishing nails and wood glue. She'd rented it from old Mr. Pruitt for 19 years on nothing more than a handshake and a Christmas card every December. Never missed a payment. Never once asked for a repair. She'd patched the roof herself, replaced the porch boards herself, hauled the dead apple tree out of the side yard herself when she was 64 years old and her arms still remembered how to swing a saw. But Mr. Pruitt had passed in February. His son in Lexington had put the property on the market the day after the funeral, and the new owner, a young couple from the city who wanted character at a discount, had given Roselyn exactly 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Her children could have helped her. Clayton was a real estate broker, for God's sake. He had relationships with every landlord in 3 counties. Marisol pulled in 6 figures at a marketing firm and lived in a 4-bedroom house with 2 empty guest rooms. Even Jonah, the youngest, who'd never quite found his footing in life, had a basement apartment that had been sitting empty since his last roommate moved out in October. Instead, the 3 of them had held what Marisol called a family meeting at her kitchen table without inviting Roselyn, and they had decided, like she was a stray cat being voted off the porch, that the best thing for Mama would be a managed senior community 45 minutes away in a town she'd never set foot in, where strangers would tell her when to eat and when to sleep and when she was allowed to step outside. Roselyn had said no, politely the first time, firmly the second. The third time she'd said no, Marisol had snapped that she was being deliberately difficult, and the phone calls had stopped after that. "Where am I supposed to go, Clayton?" Roselyn asked quietly, her voice steadier than her hands. "All three of you have spare rooms. I asked for a couch. Just a couch, just for a few weeks until I found something." Marisol let out a small, sharp sound that was almost a laugh. "Mama, we've been over this. None of us are set up for a long-term house guest. You'd be miserable in our places, and frankly, so would we. The community in Beaufort had an opening. You said no. That's on you." "I said no because I'm not sick," Roselyn answered. "I'm not confused. I'm not feeble. I'm 72 years old, and I can still thread a needle in lamplight. I'm not going somewhere to wait to die." "Then where are you going?" Jonah finally spoke up, his voice carrying the same impatient edge his older siblings had perfected. "Because the truck leaves in 20 minutes, and you're standing in your housecoat on a public sidewalk." Roselyn straightened her shoulders. The decision had been forming in her chest for 3 days, ever since she'd held her father's old brass key in her palm at 2 in the morning and remembered the promise he'd made her on the night he died. "I'm going to Daddy's workshop," she said, "on Old Mill Road, out past the Hadley Orchard." The three of them stared at her, and then Clayton laughed, a short, ugly bark of disbelief. "Mama, that place has been falling down since 1992. There's no power. There's no water. The roof's half gone. You'd freeze to death in a week." She did not look back. Behind her, she heard Marisol's voice, low and dismissive, carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Give her 3 days. She'll be calling us by Wednesday begging for the Beaufort placement." Roselyn kept walking. What none of them knew, what not one of them had ever bothered to learn, was that her father, Augustus Gus Hadley, had not been a senile old carpenter who'd left behind a worthless shed. He had been a man who'd watched his only daughter destroyed by a lie 40 years ago, who had spent the last decade of his life quietly assembling the proof of who really did it, and who had locked that proof inside a hand-carved cedar box behind a workshop door he'd sealed himself the night before he died. And the man whose voice was on the cassette tape inside that box was, at this very moment, drinking black coffee on the porch of his lake house 6 miles away, smiling at the morning sun, completely unaware that the woman he had broken in 1986 was finally, after 40 long years, walking toward the truth. The walk from Sycamore Street to the edge of her father's old property was 4.5 miles, and Roselyn had not walked 4.5 miles in one stretch since 1998. Her hip protested by the time she reached the edge of town. Her left knee, the one that had carried her through 3 pregnancies and a lifetime of standing behind a sewing machine at Hadley's tailoring shop, began to ache in that deep, grinding way that warned her she would pay for this tomorrow. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking, and Roselyn Marie Tatum had not survived the last 40 years by allowing herself to break in the middle of a road. The suitcase grew heavier with every quarter mile. The October sun climbed higher over the Kentucky hills, warming the asphalt under her thin canvas shoes. A pickup truck slowed beside her once, an older man she vaguely recognized from the hardware store rolling down his window to ask if she needed a ride. She shook her head and thanked him and kept walking. Whatever was waiting for her at the end of Old Mill Road, she had decided somewhere between her front porch and the town limits, she needed to walk to it. She needed to earn the door before she opened it. As her feet carried her past the boarded-up feed store and the empty lot where the old drive-in theater used to stand, the memories came back the way they always came back. Not in order. Not gently. They came back in a way that old wounds always do, surfacing without permission, demanding to be felt. She remembered being 32 years old in the summer of 1986, standing behind the counter of Hadley's tailoring shop in a yellow cotton dress her mother had sewn for her 16th birthday. She remembered the bell over the door ringing and Sheriff Bradford Kincaid walking in with his hat in his hand and that slow, lazy smile that had made every woman in Mosswood Hollow uncomfortable for as long as anyone could remember. He had been 38 then, 6'2", square-jawed, the kind of man the local newspaper photographed at every ribbon-cutting and 4th of July parade. The kind of man who shook hands at funerals and remembered the names of every voter's children. She remembered him asking her to dinner. Politely the first time. Roselyn had been married to Walter for 9 years by then, and she'd held up her left hand and shown him her thin gold band and laughed it off the way you laugh off a fly at a picnic. She remembered him coming back the next week, and the week after. She remembered the day he caught her alone in the storeroom, his hand pressed flat against the doorframe above her head, his breath smelling of black coffee and chewing tobacco. His voice dropped to a whisper that wasn't a question anymore. She remembered telling him no, loudly, firmly. She remembered shoving past him and walking out the back door of her own shop with her hands shaking so badly she dropped the keys twice before she could lock up. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, 2 of his deputies were standing in her shop with a search warrant signed by a judge who played golf with Bradford Kincaid every Sunday afternoon. By Saturday morning, Roselyn Marie Tatum had been arrested on the front steps of Hadley's tailoring shop for embezzlement and grand theft from the Mosswood Hollow Veterans Memorial Fund, a charity drive she had volunteered for the previous spring. The local paper ran her photograph on the front page. Handcuffed, crying, her hair in her face. Walter standing behind her with an expression nobody who saw it ever forgot. The charges were dropped 4 months later for insufficient evidence. But by then it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The shop lost 3/4 of its customers in a single summer. Walter's contracting business dried up almost overnight. The calls just stopped coming, the way they stop coming in a small town when the wrong word gets whispered in the wrong ear. Her own father, Augustus Hadley, the gentlest man she'd ever known, had stood up at the church social hall and shouted at the pastor in front of 40 people, demanding that someone, anyone, stand up for his daughter. No one did. For the next 40 years, every time Roselyn walked into the bank, the grocery store, the post office, she watched the eyes slide sideways. She heard the whispers stop when she came near and start up again the moment she passed. That's her, the one who stole from the veterans. They never could prove it, but you know how those things go. Even her own children, raised inside that whisper like fish raised inside polluted water, had grown up half believing it. She'd seen it in their faces when they were teenagers. She'd seen it in their faces just this morning. Walter had believed her until the day cancer took him in 2009. He was the only one. He had held her hand on the porch the night before he died and told her, "Rosie, the truth's going to come out one day. Maybe not while I'm here to see it, but it's coming." She had nodded and kissed his forehead and not believed him. Truth, in her experience, was a thing wealthy men could afford and poor women could not. She had not thought about her father's promise in years. Decades, maybe. He had made it on his own deathbed in 1985. No, 1995. She corrected herself, 9 years after the arrest, pressing a small brass key in her palm with hands that had gone papery and light. "Rosie," he had whispered, "when you've got nowhere left to go, when the world has taken everything from you, and there's not one soul left who will stand at your back, you go to the workshop. You unlock the door. You look behind the cabinet on the east wall. I built something for you, baby girl. I built you a way out." She had taken the key. She had thanked him. She had assumed, like daughters always assume about dying fathers, that his mind was wandering at the end. She had been wrong about that. Roselyn shifted the suitcase to her other hand, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, and saw the rusted iron gate of the old Hadley property come into view at the bottom of the long, leaf-strewn hill. The iron gate was hanging from a single hinge, tilted into the goldenrod like a drunk leaning against a fence post. Roselyn didn't have to push it open. She just stepped sideways through the gap, and 40 years of absence dissolved beneath her feet the moment her shoes touched the gravel of the old service drive. The Hadley property had been 12 acres once. Her father had bought it in 1956 with money he'd saved by sleeping in the back of his cabinet-making shop for 8 years and eating cornbread for dinner 6 nights a week. The big farmhouse was gone now, of course. It had burned to the foundation in the spring of 1998, 3 years after Augustus passed, and the family trust her father had set up had paid the back taxes every year out of stubbornness rather than any plan to ever use the land again. The orchard he'd planted with his own hands had gone wild. The split-rail fence had collapsed into the grass. Even the old well house had caved in on itself, the roof beams sticking up out of the bramble like the ribs of a dead animal. But the workshop was still standing. Roselyn saw it through a tunnel of overgrown sumac and volunteer maple, a low rectangular building of cedar planks and river stone, set back against the tree line where her father had liked it best. The roof had bowed in the middle, true. The west wall had a long diagonal crack running through the siding where a falling limb had struck it some winter she hadn't been here to see. But the bones of it were good. Augustus Hadley had built that workshop with his own hands in 1962, and a man who knew how to build did not build poorly even when no one was watching. She walked toward it slowly. The grass came up past her knees in places. Something small and brown skittered out of her path and disappeared into the weeds. The smell hit her before she reached the door. That particular scent of weathered cedar and old motor oil and dry sawdust gone soft with damp. The smell of her childhood. The smell of every Saturday morning she had ever spent sitting on an upturned nail bucket, watching her father playing a board until the curls of it came off as fine as hair. The door was a heavy slab of solid oak. Augustus had made it himself, fitted it himself, hung it himself on hand-forged iron strap hinges he'd bought from a blacksmith over in Berea. The padlock that hung from a hasp was crusted with 40 years of rust and webbed in a tangle of dead morning glory vine, and the wood around it was silvered and split. But the lock itself was still seated, still closed, still waiting. Roselyn set her suitcase down in the grass. She reached into the pocket of her housecoat, pushed past the wadded handkerchief and the quarter she'd been carrying since Wednesday, and closed her fingers around the small brass key. She held it up to the gray afternoon light. It looked impossibly small, impossibly ordinary. The little tag her father had tied to the bow with a piece of waxed twine was still there, the ink long since faded to a ghost, but she could still make out the 4 letters he had written in his careful draftsman's hand. Rose. Just that. Just her name, the way only he had ever called her. She knelt down in front of the padlock, slowly, carefully, her bad knee complaining the whole way, and fitted the key into the keyway. It would not turn at first. The pin tumblers had seized solid. She wiggled it. She breathed on it. She finally pulled an old bobby pin from her hair, the same trick her father had taught her when she was 11 years old, and worked the tip of it gently into the keyhole alongside the key, scraping at the rust until she felt something inside the mechanism shift. The lock clicked open with a small, dry, almost apologetic sound. Roselyn stayed kneeling for a long moment with her forehead pressed against the cool wood of the door. She did not cry. She had not let herself cry in front of her children that morning, and she would not start now. But her shoulders shook once, twice, and she let them shake before she stood up. The door fought her. 40 years of swelling and settling had locked it tight against the frame. She braced her left foot against the stone foundation, gripped the iron handle with both hands, and pulled with the entire weight of her 72-year-old body. The door groaned again, and then, with a sudden lurch that nearly sent her tumbling backward into the weeds, it gave. The smell that rolled out of the dark interior was not the smell of decay. That was the first thing she noticed. It was the smell of a workshop that had been carefully, lovingly closed up by a man who had known exactly what he was doing. Cedar and beeswax, old varnish, the faint mineral whisper of iron tools that had been oiled before they were put away. Underneath all of it, fainter but unmistakable, the smell of pipe tobacco. Her father had smoked a cherry wood pipe his entire adult life, and the scent of it had lived in the rafters of this building like a second roof. Roselyn stepped inside. The light came in dusty bars through the high transom window above the workbench. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and then she saw it, the long oak workbench running the length of the east wall, the pegboard above it, and the tools. The tools were still hanging in their painted outlines, the way her father had always insisted a tool should be put away. Hand planes graduated from largest to smallest. 3 different mallets. The brass-handled all her grandfather had carried home from France in 1919. A row of chisels, their edges still bright under the patina, each one resting in the exact silhouette he had painted around it 60 years ago. Nothing had been touched. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been stolen. It was as if Augustus Hadley had walked out of this room one afternoon in the summer of 1995, locked the door behind him, and left the world exactly as it would need to be the day his daughter finally came home. Roselyn stood in the doorway for a long time before she took another step. The dust hung in the slanting bars of light like fine snow, and she did not want to disturb it any sooner than she had to. There was a holiness to the room that she had not expected, a sense of having walked into a chapel that had been waiting 40 years for one specific worshiper to find it. She set her suitcase down just inside the door and turned in a slow circle. The workbench was exactly as she remembered. The vise was still clamped to the corner, its jaws closed gently around a small block of walnut that her father had apparently been shaping the last time he had stood at this bench. A single shaving curled out of one side of the block, brown and dry as an old leaf, the cut still clean enough that she could see the grain. On the floor beside the bench, the dustpan and shop broom hung from their nails. The cast-iron stove in the back corner still had a kettle on top of it. The kettle, when she crossed the room and lifted the lid, was empty and clean. It was the cleanness that broke something open inside her. He had not died at this workbench. He had not been carried out of this room by paramedics. He had finished what he was working on, swept up his shavings, washed his kettle, hung up his tools, and locked the door behind him. He had closed this place like a man closing a long letter. Every detail of the room said the same thing in her father's voice. "I knew you were coming, Rose. I just didn't know when." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She walked to the east wall. That was what he had told her on his deathbed. Look behind the cabinet on the east wall. The cabinet was a tall, narrow piece of furniture her father had built when she was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7, and she remembered watching him fit the dovetails together on the kitchen table because the workshop had been too cold that February. It was made of figured cherry, darkened now to the color of an old penny, with 2 doors and a small drawer at the bottom. He had carved a rose on each door panel, one for her and one, he had told her, for her mother who had died when Roselyn was 4. The cabinet was heavy. She knew that even before she touched it. She braced her shoulder against the side of it and pushed, and at first nothing happened, and then it slid an inch, and then another, the legs scraping faintly against the plank floor. Sweat ran down her temple. Her bad hip began to tremble. She rested for a moment, palm flat against the cherry wood, breathing in through her nose, and then she pushed again. The cabinet moved out from the wall about 18 inches. That was all she needed. Behind it, set into the cedar paneling at about chest height, was a small rectangular cutout her father had clearly made on purpose. The cut was clean, the edges sanded smooth. A wooden cover plate had been fitted into the opening, held in place by 2 simple wooden buttons that turned on dowel pins. She had built furniture with her father long enough to recognize his hand. This was not a hiding place a thief would ever find. This was a hiding place a daughter would find, because her father had taught her how he made things. She turned the 2 wooden buttons. The cover plate came away in her hand. Inside the recess, sitting on a small shelf her father had cut from a single piece of poplar, was a box. It was, without exaggeration, the most beautiful thing Augustus Hadley had ever made. Roselyn knew this with absolute certainty the moment she saw it. The box was about the size of a family Bible, made of quarter-sawn white oak with cherry inlay on the lid, and the inlay was a pattern of climbing roses that wound around the borders and met in the center in a single hand-carved medallion that read, in tiny letters no bigger than a grain of rice, "For my Rose, when the truth is needed." The corners of the box were dovetailed so finely she could not see the joint lines. The lid was sealed with a band of dark red wax that ran all the way around the seam, and pressed into the wax in 3 places was the small steel stamp her father had used on every piece of furniture he had ever built, the mark that had hung above the door of his shop for 50 years, a capital H inside a circle. He had not just hidden this for her. He had signed it. He had treated this box the way he treated his finest work, the work he was most proud of, and he had built it knowing that the next pair of hands to touch it would be hers. Roselyn lifted the box out of the recess with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the workbench, set it down gently on the oak surface, and stood looking at it for what might have been a minute or might have been 10. She did not break the seal yet. She could not. Not yet, because the moment she had picked up the box, the weight of it in her hands had cracked something open inside her chest, and the memory she had spent 40 years pressing down into the deepest part of herself had come surging up all at once. She remembered the day they came for her. Saturday, August 16th, 1986. A bright, hot morning. She had been opening the shop. She remembered turning the brass key in the front lock when the cruiser had pulled up at the curb behind her. 2 deputies. She remembered the way the heavier of the two had said her name, like he was already enjoying it. Roselyn Marie Tatum, you're under arrest. She remembered the handcuffs being too tight. She remembered Walter running out of the diner across the street, still holding a coffee cup, his face white. She remembered the Polaroid camera in the hands of the reporter from the Mosswood Hollow Gazette, and she remembered, most of all, Sheriff Bradford Kincaid himself standing across the street under the awning of the bank, watching her be loaded into the back of the cruiser, with that same lazy half-smile he had given her in the storeroom 3 days before. She had not seen that smile in 40 years, but she could see it now, perfectly, in the polished surface of the lid of the box her father had built her. Her hands began to shake. She reached for the wax seal. Roselyn broke the wax seal with the edge of her thumbnail, the way she had broken the seal on 100 jars of her mother's preserves when she was a girl. The wax was brittle with age. It cracked in 3 clean pieces along the seam and fell onto the workbench like the petals of some dark, dried flower. She set the pieces aside carefully. She had a feeling, even then, that nothing inside this box was meant to be thrown away. She lifted the lid. The interior of the box was lined in deep green velvet, the kind her father had bought in bulk from a fabric supplier in Cincinnati when she was a teenager and had never quite been able to part with even when his arthritis had ended his upholstery work. The velvet had been cut and fitted by a careful hand, and resting on top of it was a single sheet of paper, folded once, with her name written across the outside in her father's draftsman's lettering. Below that letter, beneath a second layer of velvet that had been laid over them like a coverlet, were 2 yellowed envelopes. Roselyn sat down on the upturned nail bucket she had sat on as a child because her knees had stopped trusting her, and she picked up the first envelope. It was postmarked October 9th, 1986, 8 weeks after her arrest. The handwriting on the front was small and tight and unfamiliar, the kind of handwriting a woman uses when she is afraid that someone might one day recognize her hand. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Augustus Hadley, Old Mill Road, Mosswood Hollow, Kentucky. No return address. She slid her finger under the flap and opened it. Dear Mr. Hadley, I have been your daughter's neighbor in this town for 17 years, and I do not think I have ever spoken more than 10 words to her in my life. I am writing you this letter because I cannot live with myself any longer, and because I am too much of a coward to take this letter to the people who could actually do something with it. I worked as the night dispatcher at the Mosswood Hollow Sheriff's Department from 1981 until I quit 3 weeks ago. My name is Wilma Dorr, and I was on duty the night of August 14th, 1986, 2 days before your daughter was arrested. Sheriff Kincaid came in around 11 o'clock that night with a manila folder and asked me to type up a search warrant affidavit. I asked him what the case number was. He told me it didn't matter. Just type what he told me to type. I have done a lot of things in this job that I am not proud of, Mr. Hadley, but I had never been asked to type up an affidavit with no case number on it before. The affidavit named your daughter. It described, in detail, items he claimed she had stolen from the Veterans Memorial Fund. Mr. Hadley, those items had not been reported missing yet. They were not reported missing for another full day. He was writing the search warrant before the crime had been called in. When I asked him about the date discrepancy, he told me the date didn't matter and that I should backdate the document to the previous Monday. I did what he told me. I have a daughter at the community college and a husband on dialysis, and I am not a brave woman. But I copied the original affidavit on the office copier before I backdated it. And I have kept that copy in the lining of my Bible for 2 months because I cannot bring myself to throw it away. A copy of that document is enclosed with this letter. I am sending it to you because everyone in this town knows you are a good man, and I am asking you to do with it whatever you have the courage to do, because I have run out of mine. God forgive me. Wilma Dorr. Roselyn lifted the letter away. Beneath it, folded in quarters, was a yellowed photocopy of an affidavit. The dates on the typewritten document had been altered. She did not need to be a lawyer to see it. The paper itself was a mute, ugly little proof of what Wilma Dorr had risked her livelihood to preserve. She set the affidavit down with hands that had gone strangely still. The second envelope was thicker. The handwriting on it was different, broad, slanted, written in pencil that had smudged faintly over the years. The postmark read March 22nd, 1991, almost 5 years after the first letter. The return address, this time, was simply H. Vance, RFD 4, Mosswood Hollow. She knew the name. Hollis Vance had run a one-bay auto repair shop on the south end of town for 30 years. He had fixed Walter's pickup truck twice. He had seemed, in her dim memory, like a quiet man who did not quite meet anyone's eyes. She opened the letter. Mr. Hadley, I was the man who put the new starter in your daughter's Buick this spring before she got arrested. I am writing you because last week my doctor told me my heart is no good and I am out of time to keep being a coward. 3 nights before they took your girl in, I was working late in my back bay. I had a 1979 Chrysler up on the lift. I had the radio off. The window in the bathroom of my shop opens onto the alley behind the courthouse, and through that window, around 11:30 at night, I could hear 2 men talking right under it. They were standing maybe 4 feet from my open window. They did not know I was there. One of them was Bradford Kincaid. I would know his voice anywhere. The other man was Judge Earl Pemberton. Judge Pemberton said something I will never forget. He said, "Brad, are you sure about this? She didn't do it." And Kincaid said, plain as day, "I don't need her to have done it. I need her to be done." Mr. Hadley, I had a tape recorder running on my workbench. I had been using it to record engine noises for a customer. The microphone was sitting on the windowsill. I have the cassette. I have kept in a coffee can buried under my back porch for almost 5 years. I am sending you the cassette in this envelope. I should have come to you sooner. I am sorry. Hollis Vance. Roselyn looked into the box. There, tucked into a hollow her father had carved into the velvet lining, was a single black plastic cassette tape, labeled in pencil in Hollis Vance's slanted hand. August 13th, 1986, 11:30 p.m. For a long moment, Roselyn did not touch the cassette. She looked at it the way a person looks at a photograph of someone they have lost, the way you look at a thing that you understand is going to change your life the second you pick it up. The pencil writing on the label was already beginning to fade. The plastic case was scuffed at the corners. It was such a small, ordinary, humble little object, and it carried inside it a recording of 2 powerful men deciding, over a back-alley conversation, to destroy her life because one of them had been told no in a storeroom on a Tuesday afternoon. She left the cassette in its hollow for now. There was one more thing in the box she had not yet read. She picked up the folded letter that had been resting on top of the velvet, the one with her name on it in her father's hand. She did not open it right away. She held it between her palms the way you hold a sparrow that has hit a window, the way you hold something whose smallness has nothing to do with how much it weighs. Then she unfolded it. My Rose, if you're reading this letter, then I am gone, and you have finally come home. I am sorry it took you so long. I am sorrier still that I am the reason it had to take so long. I want you to understand, before you read another word, that I knew. I knew the night they put you in handcuffs. I knew because your mother, God rest her, taught me how to look at our daughter's face and know when our daughter was telling the truth. And when you stood in that courthouse and said you had not stolen 1 penny from those veterans, I knew you had not stolen 1 penny from those veterans. I knew it the way I knew my own name. But knowing and proving are not the same thing, my darling girl, and I learned that the hardest way a man can learn a thing. Wilma Dorr's letter came to me first, 8 weeks after the arrest. I read it, and I sat at this very workbench, and I wept until I had nothing left in me to weep with. And then I cleaned my face, and I put on my Sunday coat, and I drove down to the sheriff department to put that affidavit on Bradford Kincaid's desk myself. I never made it through the door, Rose. Kincaid was waiting for me on the steps. I do not know how he knew I was coming. I have wondered about that for 30 years, and I have never been able to answer it. But he was waiting for me, and he walked me back to my truck with his hand on my elbow, like an old friend, and he stood beside the driver's window, and he said the words to me that I've carried in my chest every single day since. He said, "Gus, your girl got off light. She walked. The charges got dropped. She has her shop and her husband and her babies. If one piece of paper crosses my desk that I do not like, she is not going to walk next time. Next time it will not be the Veterans Fund. Next time it will be something a jury convicts on. And next time her husband is going to lose his contracting license. And her babies are going to grow up visiting their mother through plexiglass. He smiled at me, Rose. He smiled at me the way a man smiles when he's trying to sell you a used car. And then he tipped his hat at me and walked back inside. I was 68 years old, baby. I was a widower with a bad back and a daughter with 3 children under 10. I drove home and I burned nothing. I hid the letter. I hid Wilma's affidavit. I told myself I would wait. I told myself I would find the right moment. 5 years later, Hollis Vance brought me the cassette. God help me, Rose, I almost burned that one too. I had a chance to end it then. I had a man on tape. I had a witness who would have testified. But by then your boy Clayton was 12, and your little one was still in diapers, and I could hear Kincaid's voice in my head every time I picked up the telephone. Next time it will be something a jury convicts on, and I could not roll the dice with your children's mother. So I built you this box. I built it with the best what I had left. I sealed it with my own mark. I hid it where only a Hadley would find it, because I taught you how I make things, and I knew that one day, if the world ever stripped you down to nothing, you would remember the cabinet on the east wall, and you would come, and you would open it. I'm asking your forgiveness, my darling girl. I chose your safety over your name, and I have lain awake every night for 30 years wondering if I chose right. I do not know if I did. I will never know. But I know this. Bradford Kincaid is an old man now, too, and the protection he had over you in 1986 is not the protection he has today. The world is different. People listen now to things they did not used to listen to. The tape is still good. The affidavit is still good. Wilma is still alive, last I heard. So is Hollis. If you are ready, Rose, the truth is in your hands. Use it. Burn him with it. Burn him publicly and burn him in the daylight, the way he tried to burn you. You do not need permission. You do not need a lawyer at first. You just need a crowd and a way to play the tape. I love you, Rose. I have loved you every day of every year, including the years I failed you. Please forgive your old man. Your daddy, Augustus Hadley. Roselyn folded the letter very slowly and very carefully and pressed it flat against her chest. She did not cry. Not yet. There was something colder than crying moving through her now. Something steadier. Something she had not felt in 40 years. She walked to the workbench. On the high shelf above it, exactly where she remembered him keeping it, was her father's old battery-operated cassette player, a heavy black plastic thing from 1979 with 2 big speakers and a single chrome handle. She lifted it down. She found 2 D-cell batteries in a tin coffee can on a shelf below. She fitted them into the back of the player and pressed the power switch. A small red light blinked on. She slid the cassette out of the velvet hollow, opened the player's deck, laid the tape inside, and pressed play. For 3 seconds, there was only static. The hiss of an old microphone in an empty alley. And then, perfectly clear, a voice she had not heard in 40 years. I don't need her to have done it. I need her to be done. Roselyn Marie Tatum closed her eyes, and she smiled. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her father's workbench by the light of a kerosene lantern she had found on a shelf and filled from a tin can of lamp oil that had not been opened in 3 decades. The wick caught on the second match. The light came up steady and warm, and Roselyn worked by it the way her father had worked by it for 50 years, with her hands moving and her mind clear, and the cassette tape lying in front of her on the oak bench like a small black weapon. She listened to the recording 4 more times. Each time, it was a little easier to hear and a little harder to bear. Kincaid's voice, Pemberton's voice, the careful, quiet, casual cruelty of 2 men deciding what to do with a woman they had never bothered to know. By the 4th playthrough, she had stopped flinching. By the 4th playthrough, she had begun a plan. Saturday morning, she knew, was the Mosswood Hollow Farmers Market. It had run on the courthouse square every Saturday from April through November for as long as anyone could remember, and Bradford Kincaid had presided over it from a folding chair under the chestnut tree on the east side of the square for the last 15 years of his retirement. He did not sell anything. He did not buy anything. He sat in his chair in a pressed white shirt with his old sheriff's hat in his lap, and he held court, The way certain men hold court in small towns when they have gotten used to being the center of every photograph. The whole town would be there. The mayor would be there. The county paper's photographer would be there. Her own children, she knew, would not be there because her children did not go to the farmer's market. But that was almost better. What was about to happen needed to happen first in front of the people who had whispered about her for 40 years. Her children could read about it later, the way she had been read about. She slept finally for 2 hours on a folded canvas drop cloth in the corner of the workshop, and she woke up before dawn with the kind of clarity she had not felt since she was a young woman. She washed her face in cold rainwater she caught in a tin basin from the leak in the back gutter. She combed her hair carefully and pinned it up the way her mother had taught her, the way a woman pins her hair when she means to be looked at on her own terms. She did not have a nice dress with her. She had not packed for this. But she opened the tall cherry cabinet against the east wall because she remembered now what was inside it, and she reached past the row of small parts drawers to the hook where her father had hung his work clothes for the last 15 years of his life. His good chambray work shirt was still there, faded almost white at the elbows, pressed and folded the way he had always pressed and folded a shirt before he hung it up, even a shirt he was only going to put back on the next morning. She put on over her thin house dress. The sleeves were long enough to cover her wrists. The shoulders fit her almost perfectly because she had her father's frame and always had. She buttoned it slowly, button by button, and when she was done, she looked at her reflection in the small shaving mirror her father had nailed beside the door, and she did not see a 72-year-old woman who had been evicted by her own children. She saw a Hadley. She put the cassette tape in the breast pocket of the shirt. She put Wilma Doerr's affidavit in the left front pocket of the house dress. She put Hollis Vance's letter in the right. She put her father's letter, folded once, against her heart, inside the shirt. She walked the 4.5 miles back to town with the cassette player tucked under her arm, wrapped in a clean flour sack towel. The square was already filling when she arrived a little before 9. The vegetable stands were up. The bread woman was selling out a sourdough. Children were running between the legs of the crowd. The chestnut tree on the east side of the square had its folding chair set up underneath it, and Bradford Kincaid was already in it, 80 years old now, white-haired and a little stooped, holding a paper cup of coffee, smiling at a young couple who had stopped to say hello. The mayor stood beside him. The county photographer was lining up a shot. Roselyn walked across the square at a steady, even pace. Heads began to turn before she had crossed half the distance. She felt the first whisper move through the crowd the way wind moves through a wheat field. A small, prickling change in the air, then a longer, larger ripple. People who had not looked her in the eye in 40 years looked her in the eye now. People who had crossed the street to avoid her at the post office in 1987 stopped what they were doing and watched her walk. She did not look at any of them. She looked at Bradford Kincaid. He saw her when she was about 20 feet away. His smile did not falter at first. He was too practiced for that, but something happened in his eyes. A small, quick recalculation. The same flicker she had seen in the storeroom of Hadley's tailoring shop 40 years before, when he had realized she was about to say no to him. She stopped 6 feet from his folding chair. She set the cassette player down on the small wooden table where the mayor's pamphlets were stacked. She took the cassette out of her breast pocket. She slid it into the deck. She did not say a word until she had done all of these things, because she wanted the silence around her to grow thick enough to carry. The square had gone quiet. "Sheriff Kincaid," Roselyn said, and her voice did not shake. "On August 13th, 1986, at 11:30 at night, you stood in the alley behind the courthouse and had a conversation with Judge Earl Pemberton. You did not know that there was a microphone in the bathroom window of Hollis Vance's auto shop 4 feet from your shoulder. You did not know that microphone was running. You did not know that Hollis Vance was alive, and you did not know that the cassette was going to outlive you." Kincaid's coffee cup began, very slightly, to tremble. "I would like the people of this town," Roselyn said, "to hear your voice for themselves." She pressed play. The static came first, the same 3 seconds of empty hiss she had heard 4 times in the lantern light of her father's workshop the night before. The crowd held its breath. Even the children at the edge of the square had gone still sensing in that animal way that children sense these things, that something was happening that the grown-ups were not prepared for. And then Bradford Kincaid's voice came out of the small chrome speakers, perfectly, terribly clear. I don't need her to have done it. I need her to be done. A woman near the front of the crowd put her hand over her mouth. Judge Pemberton's voice came next, thinner with age, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever stood in his courtroom. Brad, are you sure about this? She didn't do it. And then Kincaid again, lazy and slow and pleased with himself. She told me no in her own shop. Earl, in front of God and the bolts of fabric. I'm not a man who takes no from a seamstress. The cassette ran for another 40 seconds. Roselyn did not look at the man in the folding chair. She did not need to. She watched, instead, the faces of the people in the crowd. The breadwoman, the young deputy who had been 4 years old when Roselyn was arrested, the wife of the bank president who had crossed the street to avoid her in 1989. She watched 40 years of whispers come undone in real time. When the tape ended, Roselyn pressed stop. She turned to Kincaid. He was not smiling anymore. The paper coffee cup had fallen out of his hand and was lying on its side on the bricks, the coffee soaking slowly into the mortar. His mouth had gone slack. His eyes had the particular hollow look of a man who has spent 40 years rehearsing a story and has just heard the real one played back through cheap speakers in front of 200 witnesses. Sheriff, Roselyn said quietly, did you frame me? He did not answer at first. The mayor took a step away from the folding chair, and the photographer lowered his camera, and somebody at the back of the crowd said, answer her, Brad, in a voice Roselyn did not recognize. Bradford Kincaid looked at the bricks under his shoes. Yes, he said. It came out of him like a thing being pulled. Not loud, not theatrical, just one quiet, ruined word, spoken by an old man in a folding chair under a chestnut tree on a Saturday morning in October. Yes, I did. Roselyn did not stay to hear another sentence of it. She picked up the cassette player, tucked it under her arm, and walked back across the square the way she had come. By Sunday evening, the cell phone video of the confrontation had been viewed 2 million times. By Monday morning, 3 different television stations had set up trucks at the end of Old Mill Road. Roselyn let them in. She let them film the workbench, the tools and their painted outlines, the cherry cabinet, and the small oak box with the climbing roses inlaid into the lid. She let them film her father's chambray shirt, still hanging on the door hook. She did not perform. She told the story plainly, in the same steady voice she had used in the square, and the country watched a 72-year-old woman in Kentucky tell the truth about what a powerful man had done to her in 1986, and the country did not look away. A pro bono attorney named Adelaide Quinn drove down from Louisville on Wednesday and sat at the workbench for 4 hours and took notes. Within a month, the civil suit was filed. Within 10 weeks, Bradford Kincaid's lawyers had settled rather than depose Wilma Dorr and Hollis Vance under oath. The amount was not enormous by city standards, but in Mosswood Hollow it was enough to buy back the Hadley acreage from the family trust, repair the workshop roof, run new electrical service from the road, and leave Roselyn with a comfortable cushion for whatever years she had left. Her children came to her on a Tuesday in early December. All 3 of them, on her front porch, in coats they had clearly chosen with too much care. Clayton spoke first, the way Clayton always spoke first, and he said the things he had practiced, that he was sorry, that they had failed her, that they wanted to make it right. Roselyn let him finish. Then she looked at him and she said, quietly, Clayton, you knew. He went still. You were 16 years old in 1990, she said. You came home from the hardware store one afternoon, and you were quiet for 3 days, and I asked you what was wrong, and you said nothing. Bradford Kincaid was at that hardware store that afternoon, wasn't he? Clayton's eyes filled. He was at the counter, he said. He was talking to Mr. Foley. He didn't know I was in the next aisle. He said something about you. He laughed. I knew right then, Mama. I was 16 years old and I knew, and I never told you because I was scared of him, and then I got older, and I was scared of being the kind of son who had known and not said anything, so I decided you must have done something to deserve it, because that was easier than the truth. Roselyn looked at her oldest son for a long time. You are welcome in my house, she said finally. All 3 of you are, but you're going to earn back what you threw away, And you're going to do it slowly, and you're not going to do it by writing me checks or moving me into condos. You're going to do it by showing up. Birthdays, Sundays, the hard ones and the easy ones. For as long as I have left. They nodded, all three of them. And for the first time in 40 years, Roselyn believed her own children. She rebuilt the workshop that spring, not as a museum, as a workshop. She had the floor releveled and the windows reglazed and the old cast-iron stove cleaned out and lit, and she taught herself, slowly, with hands that remembered more than she expected, the joinery her father had taught her at 6 years old. She took on small commissions. A jewelry box for a bride in Berea. A cradle for a young couple in Richmond. She signed each piece, the way her father had signed his, with a capital H inside a circle, because she was a Hadley before she was anything else, and she had finally come home to the name. On a warm Saturday in June, her great-grandson Noah, who was 6, stood on an upturned nail bucket beside her at the workbench, his small hands wrapped around the handle of the sanding block. The afternoon light came in through the high transom window in dusty bars. The smell of cedar and beeswax filled the room. "Like this, Gigi?" he asked. "Just like that, baby," Roselyn said. "Long, even strokes. Always with the grain. Your great-great-grandfather taught me on this very bench when I was your size." She put her hand over his small one and helped him guide the block. "Truth is like this wood, Noah," she said quietly. "It can sit covered up for a long, long time. But if you sand it gently, and you take your time, and you do not give up on it, it always comes back to the light." If Roselyn's story moved you the way it moved us, leave one word in the comments, just one, that describes how it would feel to finally be believed by everyone who once turned away from you. Because Roselyn's story proves what the world keeps trying to make us forget. That truth does not have an expiration date. That evidence preserved in love can wait 40 years for the hand it was meant for. That no man is so powerful that his lies outlive a daughter who refuses to die quiet. And that no matter how old you are, no matter how alone you feel, no matter how completely the world has stripped you down, it is never, ever too late to walk back into your own name. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.